Alright guys, welcome back for section 5, and this section is about political prisoners, which is a lot more complicated than might seem at first glance. Um, Before we talk about what political prisoners are, we need to talk about the law, right? Um, for most of us, we believe that the law is there to protect everybody, right? It means the law is there so that other people won't try to rob me or kill me or rape me or take my car or they're going to follow the contracts that we've legally set out on paper, um, and to make sure that the law is there to protect everybody. Here in the United States, we've put that into the Constitution, right? There are numerous amendments that have been made that are a guarantee that the law protects us not only from each other, but from the government, from foreign governments. Um, Probably the most important constitutional amendment of all of the 27 that are currently in place, in my mind, is the 14th. The 14th guarantees due process to everybody. Okay? Um, and that due process is an incredibly important thing. And that 14th Amendment and that due process clause have been used to say, okay, your rights that the federal government has to respect, because of the Bill of Rights, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, 1st, 2nd, all um, those don't just protect you from the federal government, they protect you from the entire government, local, state, federal, all that stuff. So the 14th Amendment is a really, really, really important piece of human rights law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed by the UN in 1948, has a lot of very similar language in it. Okay, equal protection of the law, arbitrary arrest, fair and public hearings, right? A lot of that is very, very similar to what we have had here in the United States for a while now. The law is also a tool to preserve social order. It's a tool for social control, right? It is the kind of enforcement branch of the government's responsibility to keep us safe, right? So the police, the courts, the correction system, those are supposed to be the enforcement of that social control and social order that we have democratically come together and said, this is the amount and kind of social control and social order we want. Here's the things we want our police and our courts and all those things to be able to do. Here's what we don't want them to be able to do. Here's the human rights we want them to respect. We've come together democratically and through our Constitution, through our laws, through our legislative representative process. We've given them power to maintain that social control and social order. What happens in a lot of places and in a lot of human history is that those tools are used to oppress the citizenry. Okay, sometimes it's the entire citizenry, sometimes it's just a small part, sometimes it's a large part. But you can look all throughout human history and see all these times when the law itself, or the kind of enforcement arms of the law, the criminal justice system, are used as tools of oppression and repression, and that when that goes to an extreme, it turns the country itself into a prison. People become afraid to exist, afraid to speak, afraid to be themselves, right? So, going back into history, famous political prisoners. Probably the most famous, at least in the Western world, was Jesus. I mean, 2,000-ish years ago, there was a guy who was speaking out about loving your neighbor and doing all these things that the government at the time really didn't like. So the government arrested, imprisoned, tried, convicted, and executed him for his essentially political beliefs, his speech and his actions that were not violent. They weren't, you know, I don't think anybody in the modern world would call what Jesus did treason, or anything that would be really deserving of a criminal justice punishment. Um, but, according to the Bible, that's what happened. Fast forward a few hundred, thousand or so years, and medieval Europe. It was kind of a common thing for one country or kingdom to kidnap the kings or nobles of other countries for, sometimes for ransom, sometimes for keeping the loyalty of that area, sometimes for kind of lots of different reasons. But they would keep these people, in England, if they kidnapped a noble or a king or whatever of another area, they would keep them in the Tower of London, which still exists today. If you go to London, you can see it. It was kind of their high-profile prison. France had a very similar thing. It was called the Bastille, and they kept a lot of people, political prisoners and such, kept there, including the Marquis de Sade, who's a very famous name. That's where we get the term sadism, because he, in the 1700s, he was writing about kind of sexual activities in a time and a place where that was really kind of not okay. And some fairly extreme sexual activities, even today we would call them extreme. And he did a lot of these. He got arrested and sent to the Bastille for these writings and illustrations of these very, what most people even today would consider private things. The Dreyfus Affair, which I believe we talked about in the last section, where a Jewish army officer in the French army was convicted and imprisoned for a crime he very obviously did not commit. That is also another good example of kind of a political prisoner in the pre-20th century kind of time frame. But then we get to the 20th century, and there's a lot more really, really good examples of political prisoners all throughout the 20th and even into the 21st century. There's Constantine, I'm going to butcher this last name, Noica. He was a Romanian philosopher who spoke out essentially against communism, and was imprisoned for his anti-communist beliefs and writings. There were many, many, many people in the American South who were imprisoned just for wanting civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. is the obvious one. He's kind of the most famous one. He was later assassinated. But he and many others were imprisoned for marching, for protesting, for holding rallies against the Jim Crow laws in the American South that kept the discrimination, it was not only discrimination, it was legally backed discrimination, right? So it'd be bad enough if it was just people being racist, but when it's the government and the law that's racist, that's even worse. Joseph Duncan and Nelson Mandela, also very, very famous people who were arrested and imprisoned in South Africa for protesting against what they called apartheid, which was essentially very kind of similar to the Jim Crow laws in the South, where this land is reserved for white owners, and this, the black people can live over there, and businesses are white and black only, and water fountains and bathrooms and all those things. South Africa had, if anything, an even more extreme version than the American South did prior to the 60s. And that apartheid lasted, I want to say, into the 90s. And Duncan and Mandela were both active in their trying to end this apartheid, and were arrested and imprisoned by the South African government. And then there's, and again, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Palden Gyatso, who was a Buddhist monk, a Tibetan monk who um, protested and was very vocal about his opposition to China annexing Tibet, um, and was held as a political prisoner for many decades. Um, and Tibet is still under Chinese rule, which is one of the big kind of human rights issues facing the world today. So, the problem is, how do we distinguish between political prisoners and non-political prisoners? Okay, it can be very difficult to distinguish who is a regular prisoner and who's a political prisoner. Sometimes it's really black and white, one or the other. But then there's an area in the middle where it becomes kind of shades of gray, right? But it begins with the politicization of identity, right? So you're not a person, you're a Jewish person. You're not a man, you're a black man. You're not a person, you're a woman, right? So, and that, when that takes on a political dimension, when that takes on an oppressive, social, but even worse, legal representation, that becomes an area where political prisoning and a political imprisonment can happen, right? But there's three different kinds of political prisoners. There are those who are in prison for their innate characteristics, right? So good example for that would be Jewish people in Nazi Germany, right? It's not that they did anything wrong, it's just that they were Jewish, and thus they were put in prison for it. Luckily, that is relatively rare. Much more common are the other two. The first of which is people who become political prisoners because of their actions, right? They went out and did something, and then that action has caused them to become arrested and thrown in prison. Now, this action can be as mild as going out and protesting, right? Attending a protest. As I am recording this, there are numerous Jewish groups who are protesting at the Border Patrol, what they affectionately call detention camps. But these Jewish groups are very concerned and are calling them concentration camps, and are protesting outside of these facilities and are being arrested for that action. Okay? And then there's the indirect political prisoners, where let's say we catch a woman robbing somebody. And normally, a man robbing somebody would have gotten 5 years in prison. That's a fairly standard punishment for this crime. But because she's a woman, we're going to give her 20 years in prison, right? And those are the hardest to kind of determine whether they're political prisoners or not, because we all agree that robbery is wrong. We want our governments to punish robbery, but they're giving a different sentence or an expanded sentence just because of her innate characteristics as a woman. So, yes, robbery's bad, robbery's wrong, she should be punished for robbing somebody, but the fact that she got 20 years instead of 5 years just because she's a woman puts it into that area where that's fairly commonly cited as examples of being a political prisoner. And I've got three picture examples here up on the board, or up on these slides. The first is this guy. He is Julian Assange. He is the head of WikiLeaks, which is they call themselves a journalistic organization that dumps large amounts of data that is usually stolen And he spent the last years, I don't remember how many years, he spent many years in essentially house arrest in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, because there was a warrant out for his arrest from multiple countries, but notably, I think, Sweden and the United States. And just finally, just relatively recently, as I'm recording this, he left the embassy and was arrested, and is currently being extradited to the United States. And many people are calling him a political prisoner because they believe it's his journalistic actions that are that were the impetus for him being arrested. But the alternative argument from the United States is that he's not being arrested for his journalistic activities. He's being arrested because he helped and taught people how to steal classified information from the U.S. government. So it's not the publication that they're kind of saying that they're going to punish him for, it's the theft itself. But is that a political prisoner or not, right? In the middle, we have Hurricane Carter, and the man who played him in a movie back in the 90s about his situation, Denzel Washington. And the short version of the story there is that I think it was a murder was committed, and this boxer, Hurricane Carter, was convicted of the crime, and it wasn't until many, many, many years later that they finally realized, or I shouldn't say finally realized, but finally admitted that, like, no, he really didn't do it. His conviction was based on some really terrible evidence. So does that count as a political prisoner? Because it's not that, like, again, we all agree murder's bad, right? We want to discourage murder. We want to punish people who commit murder. But it wasn't, so the crime he was arrested and convicted for is a crime we all agree should be a crime. The difference is he wasn't convicted because he did it. He was convicted because he was a black man, right? So that political dimension comes in even with crimes we all agree are bad, like murder. Very similarly, this is the Central Park Five, okay? They were arrested as juveniles, tried, and convicted as adults for a rape in Central Park. And they served, I think the amount of time served varied, but it was somewhere in the order of like 5 to 10 years each for this rape. And again, they found out later that these kids didn't do it. They were kind of bullied into confessing during the police interrogation, and those confessions were basically the only evidence against them. The victim didn't identify them. There was no physical evidence. The confessions were contradictory, right? So they got each of the 5 confessions or 4 confessions, or I can't remember how many confessed, but they were each done separately, and they were contradictory. They didn't even make internal sense. But they were convicted of this crime of rape and served all these years in jail. And finally, we figured out who actually did it, based on both DNA evidence, and he confessed. He was already in prison for something else, the guy who actually did it, so he finally just said, like, yeah, I did it. Because they knew, he wasn't going to have any more time added on to him. I think he's serving life for another crime. But the point is, once again, we can all agree that rape is bad, right? We want laws against rape. We want people who rape to be punished. So the political dimension comes in not with the crime itself. It's not that we're arresting these 5 people and putting them in prison because they're black. It's that we're convicting them with really terrible evidence because they're black, right? So political prisoners aren't just the people who are in prison for attending a protest. They're not just the people who are in prison for being gay or being Jewish. They're also people who are convicted of other crimes, but either are innocent or even if they're guilty, they get these kind of incredibly different or incredibly overbearing punishments, right? So again, a lot of these kind of political prisoner situations can be really hard to identify, and even not even everyone agrees whether they were political prisoners or not. Anyway, we'll be back with the second half of this section. See you then.